The human we call Jesus was and continues to be, without a doubt, one of the most influential human beings in history. With more than 2.4 billion adherents, Christianity is the largest religion. The next is Islam with 1.9 billion. And Jesus is obviously central to Christianity, and he's one of the holy prophets of Islam, which a lot of people don't realize. In fact, the so-called virgin birth of Jesus is more detailed in the Quran than it is in the Gospels. Actually, Jesus' influence on history is quite amazing when one considers that he was of Jewish peasant birth. He wasn't educated. He was probably illiterate, although some scholars suggest he may have been able to read a little bit, but it's unlikely he could write because of the expense related to learning how to read and write in the day of Jesus. He never held a political office. He wrote nothing of any kind, and he never had a private office. What we do know of Jesus is pretty limited, and it's sketchy at best. From common biblical sources and from non-biblical sources, we include the writings such as the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus and also other Roman historical records. We think that Jesus was probably born around the year 3 of the Common Era. He was probably born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. Nazareth was a tiny town, very small town of no significance. It's still there in Israel. Bethlehem appears in the New Testament stories to fulfill a prophecy in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew book of Micah, which states, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, you who are of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from the ancient days." In other words, the Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem, and so the gospel writers probably took that passage and said, well, he was born in Bethlehem. As far as the Christmas story goes, there's no agreement among the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel written generations after the death of Jesus, doesn't have a birth narrative. It starts with Jesus as an adult. Similarly, the last gospel, the Gospel of John, was written 3 generations after the death of Jesus. Like Mark, it doesn't have a Christmas story. It starts with Jesus as an adult. So the Christmas stories we have and we celebrate are from the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. But the two stories are not the same. In fact, in our modern Christmas story, and in the creches you see, and in everything we do at Christmas, we conflate the two Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew has Jesus born in a house in Bethlehem, visited by wise men, not 3, there's no mention of 3, but that's what we celebrate, who follow a star and present him with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Shortly after his birth, right after his birth, Mary and Joseph take Jesus to Egypt, and they raise him there until he's 12, fearing that he's going to be killed by Herod. That's the Gospel of Matthew. But if we look over into Luke, Jesus is born outside of Bethlehem, in a manger, in an animal trough, in a field, not in a house. He's visited by shepherds, not wise men. After worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem shortly after his birth, he goes right back to Nazareth. So he grows up in Nazareth. So the two stories are completely different, but we conflate the two. The gospel writers didn't write these accounts for historical accuracy, but for religious truths. And they used Hebrew prophecies from Hebrew scripture, which we call the Old Testament, to back up the validity of Jesus as the Messiah. What Jesus did for 30 years of his life isn't known. There are wild theories that he studied Buddhism in India, which isn't likely given the travel situation of the day and the fact that few people did travel, and travel required a lot of money, and Jesus was clearly a peasant without any financial resources. Slightly possible he was exposed to it in Galilee by passing trading caravans, but this too is a bit far-fetched, and we don't see any evidence of that in the Gospels. In any case, somewhere around the age of 30, Jesus began healing and preaching a special Jewish religious message to the Jews in Roman-controlled Judea. He developed a wide following among peasantry. He was a very charismatic guy, no question. Keep in mind, Jesus only preached to Jews, not to the Romans, not to the people of many other religions that existed in Judea of his day. Jesus was born as a Jew, he lived as a Jew, he died as a Jew. He was never anything else. At least part of Jesus' message to the Jews was that religious law and ritual, specifically the Jewish law and ritual, while important, shouldn't be the main focus of one's spiritual life. Jesus felt that every person needed to develop his or her own relationship with God. Love God with all your heart and soul, and love your neighbor as well. These are the two greatest commandments. In other words, Jesus placed the golden rule on an equal footing with loving God. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you are hurting others, you're hurting God. When you are loving others, you are showing love towards God. In the words of the Jesus scholar John Dominic Crossan, who I had the honor of receiving lectures from in seminary, John Dominic Crossan was a former Catholic priest, and he said that Jesus' words left no distinction between Gentile and Jew, sinner and saint, male or female, slave or citizen, rich or poor. He didn't attack these social structures, which were important in ancient Roman and Jewish society, but his actions undermined their presence as one of the pillars of ancient society and culture. Instead of dining with the village elders when he healed and preached in a village, as ancient protocols required, Jesus ate and slept among the people who were the outcasts and the dispossessed from society. This cannot be overlooked. By the standards of the day, it was radical behavior of the first order. The ancient Jewish Roman world was filled with social taboos based upon religion and class. When Jesus overlooked these taboos, it was viewed as political subversion by Jewish priests and the local authorities because it challenged the very essence of Roman and Jewish custom, ritual, and culture. As Dr. Crossan opined, Jesus' ministry wasn't overtly anti-establishment towards Roman rule, nor to the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, but it was covertly so. As could be expected under such circumstances, his actions led to a predictable outcome. Jesus was executed by the Roman rules as political instigator, with the encouragement from the puppet Jewish authorities installed by the Romans. In the day and time of Jesus, such religious political execution would probably have taken the form of crucifixion. The road outside Jerusalem and other Roman cities were lined with crosses of the convicted, and they usually left the bodies on the crosses as a symbol not to defy Roman society. By murdering Jesus, Roman and Jewish leadership had hoped to check the dangerous messages of the small Jewish Christian sect, but the reverse occurred. Rather than feeling they had lost Jesus, his followers believed he was still among them in some divine way. His following grew and continued to grow despite periodic persecution by the Roman government. 300 years from the birth of Jesus, Constantine, Christianity was proclaimed the state religion of the Eastern Roman Empire by the Emperor Constantine, who had recently converted to Christianity. We're not sure why. His mother was a devout Christian, so that's possibly why. In the words of the Jewish historian Josephus, writing at the end of the first century, quote, "When Pilate, upon hearing him accused of men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared," unquote. Basic to early Jewish Christian beliefs was the notion that Jesus would soon return to earth to establish a new kingdom. They believed this because Jesus taught that the world would end very soon, and evil forces would be destroyed, followed by God creating a new Jerusalem. This is what Jesus often preached. But this is where the understanding of Jesus blurs, for it is at this point where Christianity becomes subject to interpretation and theological evolution by its adherents. Without Jesus, there wouldn't be a Christianity, so he was obviously of paramount importance. But it was the writer Paul who established the basic theology of Christianity, which was then further convoluted by Greek metaphysics, which twisted basic Christianity into a deeply complex theological system capable of widely diverse interpretation. Paul never knew Jesus as a person. Paul was a Jew who in his early life persecuted Christians. At some point in his life, he clearly had a powerful conversion experience. He talks about this. Then through the decades of the 50s of the Common Era, that's more than a generation after the death of Jesus, and before any of the Gospels were written, he wrote his letters, which are called epistles, to the many early Christian communities, such as the Romans, the Ephesians in Ephesus, the Corinthians in Corinth, the Colossians, and the Thessalonians in Thessalonica, which is all these cities are still there. It was the words of Paul which first established Christian theology, and probably not the words of Jesus, since Jesus' words hadn't been recorded in writing when Paul began to write his letters. But taken as a whole, the letters of Paul can be difficult to understand because the different letters to the Christian communities contain conflicting views and ideas. It's Paul who is the darling of Christian conservatives, for many of Jesus' words in the Gospels contain universalist messages and focus on a loving God and a call for all people to love others as God loves. Paul, on the other hand, in many of his letters, revels in apocalyptic destruction as he speaks often of the elect among humanity who will be the only saved when the world will be destroyed, which Paul believed would happen in his lifetime. It says right there in his letters, he believed it would happen in his lifetime. What's also clear in Paul's letters to the early Christian communities is that he shared a basic, what's called an eschatological conviction about the end of the world. So did Jesus. According to Paul, the end time was near. As he wrote in his letter to the Thessalonians, "It will come like a thief in the night, for the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and the sound of God's trumpet will descend from the heavens, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who will be left, will be caught up in the clouds together, and we will meet the Lord in the air, so we will be one with the Lord forever." That's in his letter to the Thessalonians. He believed he was going to be alive when this all happened. Unfortunately, as Christianity developed through the centuries, the words and the life of Jesus, the man, began to take a back seat to the theological statements as set forth in the writings of Paul, to say nothing of the many heresies and the thousands of Christian sects that developed. Whole statements of beliefs and ways prescribed for living one's life, according to Paul, bear no relation to the words that scholars attribute to Jesus. There are, in fact, massive contradictions. Just consider, for example, that Jesus was condemned and executed for healing and socializing with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners of all kinds, who he loved, and he said he loved. But in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, "But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister who is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater, a reveler, a drunkard, or a robber. Do not even eat with such a one. Drive out the wicked among you," says Paul, not says Jesus. If Paul's epistles and the contradictions in the Gospels aren't enough to confuse our understanding of the historical Jesus and his message, church councils and theologians through the centuries have added their massive contributions to this task. The fact is that the letters of Paul and the Gospels present such a wide latitude for historical and theological interpretation of Jesus that Christianity developed wide-ranging dogmas and rituals. And then, in an effort to maintain some kind of cohesiveness, whether for theological or political reasons, Church councils were often summoned to determine the absolute truth and to impose their findings on Christian communities. It was, for example, the Council of Nicaea, which was called for by Constantine in 325 of the Common Era, because there were so many different ideas of who this person Jesus was, that the nature and of Jesus and the Trinity were firmly established. It wasn't established before 325. Modern Christianity today is based on the Council of Nicaea. Prior to this time, there were widely conflicting views of Jesus, his words, his teaching, and his relationship to and with God. Not surprisingly, the majority of bishops summoned by the Emperor Constantine to this council voted in agreement with Constantine's bishop, though they had separately disagreed vehemently prior to the council. Perhaps the presence of Roman soldiers outside the council building had a holy influence on their outcome. What came out of the Council of Nicaea was a set of common beliefs about Jesus, which is summed up in the Nicene Creed, which is said in a majority of Christian churches today. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so forth and so on. Some of you are familiar with it. That came out of the Nicene Creed. But this didn't stop the continued evolution or devolution of Christianity today. And what's amazing today, and no one can exactly number it, but there are some 45,000 Christian denominations and sects in the world, each one with different views of Jesus and the theology about him. That's not 45,000 churches. That's 45,000 denominations and sects. It's a lot. And each one is right? But despite the huge number of Christian denominations and sects, there's one message that was proclaimed by Jesus that is hard to deny, and this is the all-powerful message of love and peace. In the final analysis, differing Christian denominations and sects may promote entirely different Christian theologies, but they're hard-pressed to suggest that Jesus did not teach universal love and a call for peace on earth, peace among men and women. Although love and peace are messages contained in all the world's religions, and they are central components to Christianity. No one can deny that Christianity has been twisted into bizarre theologies for the benefit of political gain. No one can deny that throughout history, it was under the name of Christianity that heinous acts of barbarism had been committed by numerous people calling themselves Christians. But so too, no one can deny that Christianity is a religion about peace and love in its basic analysis, for it is truly these messages that brought Jesus to his death at the hands of the authorities in Jerusalem. And while through the centuries acts of terrorism and violence have been perpetrated in the name of religion, in the end, those responsible know they lie when they try to use Christianity as an excuse for hatred and cruelty. I know of no politician or warrior who can truly look into a mirror and claim that Jesus would stand behind anything that created violence instead of peace, hatred instead of love. We may look with shame at what we do in the way of violence, and we may even justify our acts for possibly a lot of good reasons, but we can never deny that the actions and words of Jesus promoted love and peace. I really find it strange when I hear the stories of World War I and World War II when soldiers on the front lines on both sides laid down their weapons on Christmas Day for a day of peace. There's a World War I story about soldiers on both sides coming together in no man's land between the trenches on Christmas Day to talk, to share food, to play a game of soccer together in no man's land amidst the horrors of frontline trenches in France. And yet following Christmas Day, the killing resumed. It was as though these soldiers were saying, we know we should not be killing, and we will respect the words of peace and love on this day that we celebrate as Jesus' birthday. But once this day has passed, we will resume our senseless acts of violence and atrocity. From afar, this is truly bizarre, to say the very least. We all know about Christmas, the holiday. Perhaps we tire of endless Christmas parties, Perhaps we look forward to spending time with family and friends and celebrating the holiday decorations and cheer. Perhaps we dread the endless lines at stores as we enter the feeding frenzy of Christmas shopping. Perhaps materialism is senseless to us. Perhaps we feel joy when we look at the smiles and excitement in a child's face as he or she faces a Christmas tree full of presents. Perhaps we feel lonely because it is on holidays when aloneness is most intense. Perhaps we feel that 2,000 years ago humanity was given a blessing. Perhaps Christmas is a word that leaves us cold or mad or even sad, or is a word we really can't relate to. In any case, Christmas in its purest form is a special day because it does represent a special, perhaps miraculous day in the history of humanity. However you feel about the religion about Jesus, the ideas and theories and theologies concocted over the centuries to try to explain Jesus the human, Jesus was born to humanity and grew to be an itinerant religious teacher who spoke of the universal love of God and the importance of love and peace and service to others. To the horror of those who opposed him, Jesus believed in the inherent dignity of every human being, including men and women, slave and free, Gentile and Jew, gifted and dispossessed. Peel away the layers of theology around Jesus, and you will find a humble human being who walked in the service of God and called for all persons to live in peace and to demonstrate unconditional and continual love. And he lifted these actions above all others. Religious law and ritual he simply cast aside. He stood by his words, and he was murdered as a result. It's easy to criticize Christianity for all its excesses and all the human horrors perpetrated in its name over the centuries, but it's not possible to criticize Jesus the man, for his actions and the way he lived his life created a message and a standard of living that has promoted peace and justice, liberty and love like no other in human history. I would maintain that it was the messages of universal peace and love articulated by Jesus that ultimately transformed civilization by eventually abolishing slavery, creating democracy, and ultimately creating change that fostered the values that promote the inherent dignity of every human being, even though this work is not yet done. It was Jesus who inspired the living and caring lives of men and women throughout the centuries, people like St. Francis, John of the Cross, Hildegard of Bingen, and Mother Teresa. It was Jesus, and not the religion about him, who inspired great transformers of society like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others, so many others. Christmas is a great day because it is a symbol of what is possible in human relations, and it is a day to celebrate the message of Jesus, the message of peace and love. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of one of the most unique human beings in history, a person who established a way of living that has transformed the world and the way we look at ourselves and others. Christmas is a special time because it calls us to look at ourselves, the type of person we are and the type of person we are becoming. Christmas can be a time of a new beginning. Like the venerable Ebenezer Scrooge, it can be a time for transformation and the beginning day of being a more caring and loving person. May Christmas be a time for peace on earth and a reminder that we are called by all that is sacred in creation to love each other every day and to love others every day of our lives. Peace be with you.